This last week was a bit of a unique day for Amanda. At the last of the tax deadlines rolled around, this year falling on a weekend meant that everybody that still had files to turn had till Monday morning. So Sunday night, she was up all night. That is not something she relishes. When I had my IT business, it was pretty common for me once a month at least to stay up all night working on clients' systems remotely. And that was fine. I was younger then. I tried doing it with her last Sunday night. Yeah, it didn't work. Made it till about 2 or 3 and I crashed. It's difficult. I used to find working at night enjoyable in a sense. Everything's quiet, even the neighbors. But one thing I rarely do is to pray at night. I know an awful lot of people, that's the last thing they do. They're lying in bed and they pray. And for me, if I lie in bed and pray, I never finish. I fall asleep before I get to the end of the kinds of things I want to talk to my Father about. And so my prayer life is much more punctuated throughout the day, beginning in the morning and going throughout the day. An interesting situation was the case with our Lord, though. We're told that he made it a habit or a custom, King James Version would say, to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, a small garden inside the olive groves on the east side of the city of Jerusalem. Jesus grew up, of course, in Nazareth. So the time that he is talked about that way in the writings of the Gospels, that was at the last year or two that he was in Jerusalem. And when he was in Jerusalem and still during the daytime teaching his 12 special disciples, later to be called apostles, and also the people of the city, Jesus made a habit, we're told, of oftentimes going to the garden. We're not told what he does there, except for one instance, that very long, all night long time that he spent in the garden when he was about to be betrayed, marched into town, put on a mock trial, and eventually to end up outside of town on a hill and there to be crucified. Knowing that that hour was coming, we're told by Jesus, he did make his way to Gethsemane from the outer room, or not the outer room, the upper room where he observes Passover with the 12 and with others. All 4 accounts of the gospel include something about that time in Gethsemane. It's a time that, to me, went from a place of comfort and solace and relaxation and communion with his Father to absolute chaos. Everything got turned upside down. His trial was ridiculous, to say the least. And his life became chaotic, being bounced from one place to the next and finally up the hill. But that's what I want for us to look at this morning, a time that, I forgot the notes. A time in which Time would be, in one sense, compressed for him. In another sense, it must have been the longest day of his earthly life. And we can only imagine what it must have been like for him. That plot of ground out of Gethsemane is now surrounded by a wall and is laid out in a modern European garden, flower garden even, type of setting. To our group, when we were there, about 25 Christians, we spent a short period of time praying there. And it gave somewhat of a surreal sense, imagining the calmness and peace that we could find in that place, that Jesus had, no doubt, many times. And yet this night was anything but peace. All four of the accounts of the gospel talk about it, though John says really very little. Mark and Matthew just called the place, he said it was a place named Gethsemane. Luke says only that they went to the Mount of Olives and came to the place, specific in the Greek language. He came to the place without either naming it or describing it, inferring that the readers would know what he's talking about. John says that he went over the Kidron Brook, which lay between the east side of the city of Jerusalem proper and then the Garden of Gethsemane. And so John says that he went over the brook Kidron where there was a garden. So what do we know actually from these accounts when we put them together is far less than at least I, and probably you too, would really like to know. And yet on another sense, I don't want to get that close. Songs like the one we just sang a moment ago, I find very difficult to get through. My mind becomes a rolling scene of dark and loneliness. Numerous families of substance that made their homes in Jerusalem, we're told, had small garden areas, even within the valley that, or the hillside, I should say, that had their olive trees and other produce that they would grow. Within the garden was olive trees at that time, even as far into the 7th century after Jesus was here. The original ones were, of course, laid down or cut down by Titus, the Roman general, when he came in to besiege the city of Jerusalem itself. But Jesus left with his disciples following the meal and went into the garden and then left them to stay. And he took only Peter, James, and John along with himself, going deeper into that area. And the 3 plus Jesus went on ahead to pray in solitude. Luke says that he went about a stone's throw from them and then left Peter, James, and John at that spot, and he went on alone. In any case, it's not so much important as to what that garden was like as it is what happened in that garden. And at the end, what happened to him was that he left them behind, and we get our final view of the Master in solitude and alone. It's interesting that the Apostle John, the one that seemed to have been closest to Jesus, did not even record the prayers that Jesus offered in the garden that night, though he does say some interesting things that the others do not. Luke had already captured the note of anguish that he was about to go through in Luke chapter 12 and verse 27. Regardless of whether the wording of the prayer he records is to be considered hypothetically a question, or if it was a petition to God, But Jesus went through a torturous, perhaps few hours at the end of that day. The fourth gospel, or evangelist John, proceeds immediately to tell of the coming of the traitor Judas with the temple police and a cohort of the Roman soldiers. And as our song will have us sing in a few minutes, they bound the hands of Jesus in the garden where he prayed. The irony, I guess you would say, praying in a garden and they bind him. We don't know how much Jesus, in detail anyway, knew, but he knew what was going to happen. He had lived his life up to this moment for the things that were about to happen. Before we go to any of the accounts of the Gospels, though, there's a passage in Hebrews that I think helps us understand a little bit more about what went on that night. In Hebrews 5, verses 7 through 9, the writer said, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. There's several things in there. We could spend time even just in this one passage. Jesus praying, loud cries, tears, and the comment that he was praying to the one who was able to save him from death. You realize that, don't you? When Jesus was in the garden and talking to his Father, he knew that his Father could let him out of the deal that they had made. And yet he would end by saying, but not my will, but yours be done. Jesus was human. I think we see the humanity of Jesus more in this garden scene than any other time in his life. The heartache that we can't understand. I mean, there are people who are on death row. There are those who see their life coming to a rapid end because of crime. But unlike Jesus, we are never as close to God as we will one day be in heaven. But remember, Jesus had what we might say the first half of eternity in heaven with his Father, never separated in any way one from another. And now Jesus has come down to this place, lived here for 30 plus years, and now he's in the garden and he's thinking about what is about to take place on Golgotha. Not that he is going to die physically. Oh, he knew that. And the thought of that had to have been difficult. But what was far more difficult, and we cannot comprehend, is that for the first time in his existence, he was going to be separated from his Father. I don't mean geographically, that's been going on. I mean the closeness, the intimacy that the Father shared with the Son had always been. And now, by taking upon himself the sins of all mankind back and forward, Jesus, because of that sin, would now be separated from the Father. And I suspect that it was that knowledge, that foreknowledge of a sense, that knowledge that he had before he ever came, that this was going to happen, but now he's there. Now it's real. He is about to experience a separation from the Father that he had never experienced before, and thankfully will never experience again. But that drove him to tremendous anxiety. But as far as he was concerned, it was the doing of his Father's will that was of utmost importance. We're told by John that in the midst of all of this chaos that was going through his mind, and what was happening on the outskirts of the city with the guards and the police, if you will, coming to nab him, to cuff him, to haul him away. In those closing moments, he begins to think about what life was about to entail, and that his obedience was going to bring about salvation for all men. But it's the Apostle John that says that he was in such agony that heaven sent help. And heaven sent an angel to be with Jesus. One day, we'll know that angel's name. We'll hear the story firsthand of his time in the garden. The only time we're ever told that an emissary from heaven comes to earth and counsels Jesus, and maybe just gives him a shoulder to cry on. But it's as close as Jesus was going to get that night to heaven itself. And God heard him and sent an angel to help him. And so there are at least four comments that are made, three by Jesus directly, that happened in that garden. There were a number of things that were said, but we're going to look at the things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke said. Some of you may have a parallel gospel. We used it once some time ago. And the neat part about it is they kind of, especially with the Gethsemane scene, are able to take the things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all said and congeal them into one flowing narrative. And it makes it easy to, in a short period of time, read through all the accounts put together that we have of what was going on with Jesus in that garden. The first statement that is made by Jesus, I want to look at this morning, is Jesus said that my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. That's the King James translation of it. NIV says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. Something you and I will never experience because we've never had the closeness with the Father like Jesus did. And now he was about to experience complete separation. Another translation says, my heart is so filled with sadness that I could die. I think that pretty well says it. Jesus says, you know, if it had it up to me, I'd just skip it. Let's not do it this way. Let's find another way. But he knew there was no way except the Father's way. It seems certain that these words are an echo from Psalm 42 in the Greek Old Testament, especially. My soul is cast down, full of sadness at the time of the festival, yet realizes that there are grounds for hope in God. And you see, that was what saved Jesus in one sense, too. He knew that it would not end on Calvary. He knew that there was more than the death that he would experience. But at this point in time, he says, this is almost too much to bear. Then we find a second statement that is made by Jesus. or about him. It says, in being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. I want to ask the Apostle John too, why didn't you record any of Jesus' prayer in that garden? Matthew, Mark, and Luke all had parts of the prayers that Jesus offered. John doesn't echo it at all. Why? I suspect maybe because of the closeness that he shared with Jesus, closer than Jesus and any other man. And maybe it was just hard for him to bring himself to echo the words that Jesus had called out. But he does make this one statement. Interestingly enough, John makes this statement, not Luke, because the terminology that's used here, I'm told, has to do with medical terms. When he's talking about this agony, it's the kind of utter physical and mental and emotional exhaustion that one can feel from one time to another. His strength apparently grew just so weak that, as I said, heaven sent an emissary to make his passing time in the garden a little easier to bear. And then there was a third and final thing. It was not so much what Jesus said, but what was said about Jesus and the suffering that he was going through. It mentions that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. I have read most of my life everything that I could get a hold of that would help me to understand what Jesus was going through in his life, and in particular, this moment. Whether it's a figurative description of the agony that Jesus was going through, or if it was a medical situation that he was going through. I suspect that maybe it was a medical situation that he was going through. There is a condition in which, under great stress and emotional turmoil, blood can actually, and has on occasion, actually come out of the pores of a person so incredibly pained with what they're going through. This could, and there are records of bloody sweats. This may have been, or it may have only been a figurative term, what Jesus was going through. To say the least, Jesus had never and would never again go through the stress and turmoil that he did at this point in time. His sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. It's William Hendrickson that talks about good evidence that the physician was talking about, as he wrote, this bloody sweat situation. You and I will never go through, dare I say, the excruciating pain of the garden. You know, don't you, that the word excruciating is based on the same English word, crucify. When we talk about excruciating pain, it's an attempt to describe what man from time to time will go through that is as close to a crucifixion pain that a person can go through. But the Father was about to bring him through something far greater. And eventually, only 3 days, and he would be raised and returned eventually to heaven itself again and rejoin. And I can only imagine what the scene must have been like when Jesus comes home. But he still had 3 days that he had to go through. There's a passage in Hebrews that I think needs to be remembered. From chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. For although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made complete, being made perfect, being made whole, He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, but designated by God as a high priest. Only God can change such pain, such turmoil, such chaos into a reunion that will last forever. I wonder if after his resurrection, Jesus returned to that garden. As a human, I tend to think, no way. I'm not going back there, not back to where it started. And the pain I suffered and went through at that time, the mixed feelings that I had. It's all of this which brings us every Sunday to where we come back together again and remember Jesus' death, that in one sense, in a spiritual sense, began a long time before Calvary, but in a very painful sense, that pain of separation began in the garden, and a garden that had been for some time a place of solace and comfort, and became chaotic and painful and separating. And so I think it's appropriate that we at this time sing one more song before we take of the Lord's Supper. And we'll sing a song about being in Gethsemane alone. Eric.